Off. So let me begin by welcoming everyone to this launch event for our More Than Human Constitutions, which is a special double issue of the Review of Constitutional Studies. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Richard Maley. I'm the managing editor of the journal, and it really is a phenomenal privilege. And I mean that super sincerely today. It's a phenomenal privilege to be able to host this event and to express my gratitude to everyone who invested their time and their energy and their attention and their creativity into this, I think, really incredible project. And I will say a bit more about those people in a few moments. Just before I get there, I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from Treaty 6 territory today. And I'd accordingly like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestors, the traditions, and the spirit that first drew Indigenous peoples. That includes the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Saulteaux, and Inuit to this unique gathering place. And in acknowledging the territory that I'm speaking from, I'd also like to acknowledge the legal orders, the systems of governance, the languages and the cultures that have shaped this land across many centuries and beyond. And I'd like to further acknowledge that as important as it is to do land acknowledgements like this one, it's only one tiny, even minuscule step in a much larger process of reconciliation that needs to take place across this land. Now, my main job and my kind of easy job this afternoon is to introduce the guest editors of the special double issue, Professors Lindsay Borrows and Jess Eisen. Just before I get there, though, I do have two quick announcements. So the first one is just to give you a sense of how we're going to run this session. And for anyone who's done one of our webinars before, this one will be a little bit different because normally we would have about 30 minutes for our guest speakers to present their ideas, and then we pivot to 20 or 30 minutes of Q&A. But since this is a launch for a very large, indeed a special double, issue of a journal, we've got a lot of speakers to hear from. And so we're going to proceed in 10-minute increments right up until the hour. And we'll go in the following order. We'll hear from Jess and Lindsay, the co-editors of the issue first. And we'll then hear from four of the other authors who contributed to the issue, Darcy Lindberg, Hannah Askew, Stephen Wood, and Pamela Spalding. Who'll be speaking in that order. So apologies in advance that we won't have time to open up for Q&A the way that we normally do. I take for granted that the richness of the presentations will more than compensate for this. So that's announcement number one. My second announcement is a piece of really good news. So normally when we publish a issue of the review, it's paywalled for a full year, and then at the 1 year mark, it's released open access on our website. With this new double issue, however, and this is the first time, at least as far as I know, that we've done this, we're dispensing with the 1 year paywall, and we're making it fully free and fully open access as of today. And I think if you look at the chat, I don't know if it's there yet, but it should be there in the next minute or two. You should be able to find a link to the full issue, which is now available via our website, and that's constitutionalstudies.ca. Okay, so on that very positive note, I'd like to introduce our first speakers of the day, Professor Lindsay Borrows of Queen's Law and Professor Jess Eisen of University of Alberta Law. And rather than doing a kind of stale bio reading, and I'm guilty of doing that many, many times in the past, we'll just post the bios in the chat. Which frees me up to say a much more heartfelt thank you to both of you, Jess and Lindsay, for everything, for stewarding this really incredible project, for your own scholarly contributions to the project, and you know what, also just for making my very tiny role in the project such an absolute pleasure. My job, like I guess any job, is fulfilling when I'm lucky enough to work with people who are kind and motivated and engaged and collaborative. And this project was so incredibly fulfilling on all of those fronts. So thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Jess. You've been incredible collaborators, and thank you for giving us this incredible body of scholarship as well. And with that, I will hand over the virtual floor to both of you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard, for that introduction. And I'm going to begin by letting everyone in on a little secret, which is that all of us here are not only colleagues and contributors to the special issue, but we're also friends. And so, in that spirit, we are bringing some sleepover party energy to this special launch right now. And it's just a delight to be together and to share ideas. Hopefully, everyone has some jokes prepared. We'll see. Darcy has promised to embarrass himself in front of everyone. And we want to entice you through these short snippets of these presentations to pick up this special issue that people have spent a lot of time really thoughtfully thinking through the theme that we're investigating, which is at the heart, this entire collection is really looking at the entanglements and tensions between various approaches to constitutional law and how it interacts with the more than human world. And specifically, we're looking at Canadian state law and also Indigenous legal orders. So I'll speak to our introductory article to invite you into how we're viewing this collection. And in our beginning, we talk about the kind of mainstream dominant approach to constitutional interpretation in Canada, which is this idea of the living tree. And when Jess and I were visiting with one another, we found it quite interesting that this living tree theory is not actually attentive to living trees. And we wondered why choose this term in a constitutional order that could do so much more to integrate itself with the more than human communities that we depend on and who depend on us as well. And we've termed this collection our more than human constitutions. And we recognize that these terms need a bit of defining. So when we talk about constitutions in this sense, we're really thinking broadly about what is it that is foundational to different legal orders and legal systems. How is it that we constitute ourselves? We recognize that more than human beings also have constitutive ways of being and that we influence one another's constitutions. And when we say are more than human, it took us a long time to figure out what term to use, and we still don't think this term is perfect in English. But by this, we mean plants and animals and water and rocks, in some Indigenous legal orders, weather and stars and rainbows. It's these animate beings, life forces, relatives, kin relations that live with us here on this planet. And then we use this term our as well. And we were very concerned about using that term, our more than human constitutions, because we didn't want to be possessive and have people think we as humans were claiming that it's our uh, possessive ownership over these different beings. But we're using this term to say our as humans and more than humans together, and that we live in these communities and that there are times and places where we can speak together from this our voice. But this brings us to the risky intersections of doing not only work, interspecies work, but also intersocietal work between Canadian state law and Indigenous legal orders. And this brings us to the story of the wampum. And in our introduction, we take a lot of guidance from, for those of you coming from Ontario, For example, today in Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories around the Great Lakes region, this is really a place of wampum and treaties being recorded through these wampum belts. And we take a lot of guidance from the whelks and the quahogs, which are the two intertidal species that form the material base of the beads of the wampum. And just as we as humans live in intertidal spaces, liminal spaces with one another, and we are in both kind of spaces of competition, but also nurturing. We help each other, we hurt each other, we are just deeply woven into one another's lives. And these whelks and quahogs similarly exist in that type of relationship with one another. And I find it really instructive that within Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee law, Huron-Wendat law, other legal orders that might use wampum, literally woven into the ways we record law is this idea that we are always in a risky intersection with one another, that we have the capacity to hurt and to help, and we need to be attentive to these possibilities in the world and try and live in ways that support mutual flourishing. So I'll pass it over to Jess to explain a bit about the contributions of those who are not here today.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Lindsay. My humble role here is to try to represent some of the incredible pieces of work in this special issue for which the authors are not present to represent themselves. So just know that what I'm offering here is going to be relatively brief. And as Lindsay has said, we hope that this is just taken as sort of an invitation to pick up the special issue because truly, every piece in it, I feel like I learned so much from, and I really I'm commending my own special issue, but I'm talking about my colleagues' articles, which I think I just really recommend them. So I'm going to start off with just a brief call out to the articles contributed by John Burroughs and Jenny Nadelsky, respectively. So we chose to include them up front in our special issue because these are two scholars who really informed this project in so many ways, sort of literally in some cases and figuratively, the parents and grandparents of some of the thoughts that are developed and explored in the papers here. So John Burroughs has an article on learning Anishinaabe law from the earth. His piece explores the more than human as not only a resource, but also a participant in Anishinaabe law. And he uses a series of storied teachings to explore not just the benefits of learning from the earth, but also the hazards, the room for conflict and misinterpretation. And ultimately, arrives at a conclusion that this effort to try to learn and grow through engagement with the more than human world is not an individual enterprise, but is instead something that we do in familial, social, and legal systemic settings that can either build or thwart our capacities to receive teachings from the more than human world. And for her part, Jennifer Nadelsky's work focuses on state constitutional law, asking what would be required to actually transform Canadian state law in order to better account for our collective kinship with the more than human world. And in doing this, she picks up a number of threads that fans will recognize from her previous scholarship, the meanings of autonomy and freedom, of rights and responsibilities, and what would it actually mean to transform these concepts and norms in order to better attend to the more than human world. And she is very attentive to the obstacles, practical, institutional, and imaginative that such a project would entail, but holds out hope that the reality, the science of interdependence could unseat the Canadian state legal commitment to its traditions of individualism, which are in tension with that enterprise. My own colleague, Adebayo Mejikalabe, explores the concept of dark innovation, meaning slow, under the radar, incremental transformations, as a framework for thinking about how the jurisprudence under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms might better adapt to address urgent questions of climate justice, exploring a number of different doctrinal areas. Lindsay, who you have already heard from here today, Lindsay Borrows, offers a piece on learning law from plants, exploring the place of plant knowledge and its distinct place within Anishinaabe and Canadian state law. And significantly, the portrait she paints does not suggest a sort of static position of plants in either legal order, but instead emphasizes disagreement, contestation, ongoing opportunities for growth, and calling out in particular one of her own areas of expertise, land-based pedagogy, as a tool to help overcome plant bias, this inattention and inability to learn lessons from plants and to receive their wisdoms. We also have a piece contributed by another of my University of Alberta colleagues, Rebecca Jimenez, who explores Indigenous treaties with the more than human world. This is a theme we're going to hear about more from Hannah Askew today. But in Rebecca's case, building on her years of community engaged research with West Moberly Nation, First Nation, she explores Cree and Denizah treaty relationships with moose and the implications of those pre-existing treaties with subsequent entrance into treaties by those nations with the Crown, in Treaty 8 in particular. We also have a contribution from Manisha Deka, a mentor of mine and icon in the field of animal law, exploring animals, colonialism, and the rule of law, exploring whether the Canadian state legal commitment to rule of law might be hospitable to increased or improved relations with other species. And she engages this question with really attention and care for the place that, quote, rule of law has held in imperialist and colonial projects. But her ultimate conclusion is, given rule of law's promise to restrain arbitrary power, that there are really helpful aspects there that might make it a useful tool for addressing the circumstances, in particular, of animals who under Canadian state law are often subjected to unrestrained violence and coercion of the kind that rule of law might help to respond to. And then finally, my own contribution, The Unwritten Constitution and the More Than Human World, explores the possibility that in order to understand the place of the more than human world in Canada's state constitutional order, we need to confront some uncomfortable truths about durable hierarchies at the heart of Canada's state legal order. And in order to do so, I suggest that the unwritten constitutional principles, democracy, rule of law that have been so celebrated by the court, function alongside what I'm calling shadow commitments that have this same stable, durable, binding quality, even though they are things that are painful for many to name and confront, and that among these are interlaced shadow commitments to the subordination of Indigenous legal orders and to relations of hierarchy and exploitation with the more than human world. Not a prescription for apathy, but offered in the spirit that we can't change what we cannot tolerate knowing. So that's my brief summary of the articles that are not represented by their own authors here today. And with that, I will pass it back to Richard, who's keeping the queue as we move through the rest of the presentation. So thank you all for listening and for being here today.
Thanks so much, Jess and Lindsay. I'm going to keep things moving quickly. So our next speaker and the first of our non-editing authors is going to be Darcy Lindberg. I'll post Darcy's bio in the chat. Actually, I see Kira's already done that. So you can find Darcy's bio in the chat. Darcy is an assistant professor at the University of Victoria, and his areas of expertise are Indigenous legal orders, Cree law and governance, constitutional law, ecological governance, and treaties. Darcy, I'll hand over the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you, Stefan. And everybody else, grateful to be here. Congrats, Jess, Lindsay, and Richard on this publication coming through from afar. I can see the work that has been gone in, and so just want to applaud you once again for reaching there. I'm really looking forward to engaging more with all of the folks who have written in there. I've heard people speak about it and I've read a little bit, so I'm just really excited for that. And I have a brief time to talk about my thinking here. One, I didn't realize it was a sleepover, but I would have been dressed appropriately. I'm in my office for this. The second thing is I promise to embarrass myself. I tell my students now there's always one crooked tree in the forest because that's usually in a class. Very quickly, I embarrass myself some way or other. So we'll see if the crooked tree props up here, which it probably already has. Yeah, so my thinking here, my curious question when I was asked to be a part of this is really thinking about constitutions and constitutionalism. So part of what I do is teach here at the University of Victoria in the Trans-Systemic program that thinks about constitutionalism in a pluralistic way, so to speak. And really, I was thinking, like, what is the natural life cycle of a constitution was kind of like an animating question. If we think about constitutions as an expression of constitutionalism, and there's a question whether this is even just a proper way to think about this. But really, I was thinking, quite honestly, in a lot of ways, this isn't in the writing in there, but my Chapan or my great grandmother was born in the 1900, the year 1900, and passed away, went home in 1995, right? And so I just think about the changes in my grandma Wolf's life in terms of society around her, but also being governed by almost the same constitution for all of her life, and then these changes we see in 1982 as well. And then just thinking about in terms of Canada's constitution when we think about the framing as well, there as well. So I was thinking about what within Nahia Pamatsuin, so Cree way of being and living, tell us about a natural life cycle of a constitution, and about the animacy of a constitution generally. And so for Cree folks out there, will know this word Manatsuin, and I know people who speak higher Cree will say it better. But it's this idea of the respect or civility with the more than human world, right? That attaches to it. And so just really thinking about this in terms of how we think about constitutionalism generally is kind of where I went with this. And so there's two terms if you get a chance to read my article that I think about, and one is this idea of constitutional kindness. And so this is something that, again, was just thinking about as I was writing this, or some other things that I've done. And really, this is thinking about an ethic grounded in like an inspirited relational nature towards the more than human world, to use that language we use within this thinking. And just real affirming that non-human beings have a right to meal pamatsuin, or a good way of living, a good life. And that as humans, we have reciprocal duties towards that good living, right? So that's that concept. So the deeper ethic within this, which I don't really explore in this article, which is deep in my thinking, is that we know and I'm going to speak from a Cree perspective, that a lot of our teachings, our stories tell us that actually the more than human world, our ability to exist is based on a ethic of constitutional kindness that emanates outwards from the more than human world, right? So the idea that I could not survive in this world without everything around me. Oh, everything's blurry, sorry. Around me. But even the clothes on my body, right, come from the more than human world, right? And so we have many stories, teachings, lessons within language. Our old ones carry these stories that we are, as we say, a naked baby in the world in a prairie storm without the more than human world. And we have quite literally stories that talk about that, right? Of being lost in the prairies and needing the world to take care of us there as well, right? So I borrow that idea of constitutional kindness. There's one way you look at it is from humans out, but the reason we do that through my teachings is that because we know that that first kindness that comes from the natural world towards us that allows us to live, right? So at the heart of this, so the engine of constitutional kindness is regeneration. This is kind of where I don't know if I'm speculating or I'm just kind of talking, putting forward, so to speak. And this idea of regeneration is that constitutionalism has natural cycles. There's a birth, there's a life, there's a death, and there's rebirths, right? And so this is kind of like the animating thing within the way I think about this. So just thinking about what does it mean to have a regenerative constitution, I think in my thinking, one, it means there's intergenerational agency to change it, to change fundamental commitments, right? So that Um, you know, we often think about our future generations in that sort of way. And I think about because that is such an important thing in Cree life, it has to be something that's constitutional as well, right? That my children have the ability to think about the world, have more understanding of the natural world, that they should be able to set constitutional commitments from that orientation, right? And there. And the other one is just thinking about ongoing transformation of terms and just really a very conscious acceptance that constitutions like living beings will pass on and be renewed, right? In that sort of sense. There's critiques of Canada's constitution. I think it's non-regenerative. Um, it really lacks explicit duties towards the Muth and Hermanwald, which a lot of people talk about and nuance that. I know that's a very general statement that I'm saying there, but we also know that amendment to the formal constitution, the written constitution of Canada is really difficult, right? So the thrust of Indigenous nations trying to have some space, with that comes our collective ideas about how we should be in relation with the more than human world. And we find that gets turned aside. So really, I look to these areas within Cree life, Nahil Pamatsuin, as a way to start to, again, I'm going to use the word speculate mostly because I can't think of anything else this morning to say, that we can think about a constitutionalism that is regenerative. And I look at our lands and territories, our thinking on that, Nahil Aski, language, and then our stories, our narrative cycles, right? And each of these really contain the ability for us to think, to revisit, to nourish, to renew constitutional thinking over time, right? So I'm not going to go into detail because I was not keeping track of time when I started here, but I will say this, our lands, we have our Wagotwa and our relationship with our more than human beings that create animacy, right? They're not things, property, that allow us to move along the lines when we think about this way of being. Our language it has its own animacy as well. It's very verb based, as all Algonquian languages are, and with that allows us to think about even when we make a constitution a noun. If we use our languages, it gives it that adamancy within it, a way to think about us. And then our stories, right? Our stories, our intellectual traditions that are really steeped in constitutional kindness, especially that version that I've kind of talked about a little bit, where the more than human world is teaching us about our relations to it as well, right? I just, I guess it's encouraging myself in this writing is to look at these areas within Cree life to think about a regenerative constitution that will live, die, become rebirthed, that we can have new thinking towards the more than human world. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I think that is just the right amount of information.
Darcy, your internal clock is so much better than mine. You were right on time without keeping time.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. My students
So,
did
so,
not
so I'm
think
going to
so.
hand over now to our next speaker, who is Hannah Askew, who's the executive director with the Sierra Club in BC. So, Hannah, the floor is now yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. I also would really like to express my gratitude to Lindsay and Jessica and Richard for the invitation to be part of this project. It's was such a gift, and as I was just rereading my own paper in preparation, I realized that, sorry, I'm looking after my neighbor's dog who's startled by my voice here. Um, um, That's okay. Um, Anyhow, I realized that the of all of the papers that I've published, academically or not academically, that this is really the paper that is closest to my heart in terms of really engaging with the core questions that have driven me throughout my professional career and that have also been the most important to me in my personal life. And I think that the reason for that is the timing, which is that I actually wrote this paper. It was very late, and Jessica and Lindsay were so patient with me. But I had made a commitment to do this paper about a year and a half prior to actually writing it, and I was really busy getting ready for maternity leave. And I went on maternity leave I was 39 weeks pregnant, And I hadn't even started the paper, but I'd been thinking about it a lot. And I really wanted to honor my commitment to these amazing women that had invited me. And I was so grateful to be part of the project. But I kind of wrote the paper just in a trance. And I literally pressed send to you guys when I went into labor. But it was such a beautiful moment for me because the paper took me back to the time that I spent actually living with Lindsay and her family and her community. And it was based on these teachings that were shared with me that have just been so precious and transformative to me from her community on Anishinaabe law. And it was in that spirit that I brought my own daughter into the world, and the timing just it was just so meaningful for me. Um, and when I was reading the paper again today, now I'm raising a toddler because that's almost 2 years ago, and I realized that the same questions that the paper addresses are the questions that my daughter is now starting to grapple with. So these basic questions that toddlers have around, you know, who is my family? Who is my community? Who do I belong to? What are the choices that I have? Do I matter? And I think that at the heart, the question that this special series addresses is around community and around reciprocity. And Lindsay, I loved how you opened by talking about how we all have this capacity to heal and this capacity to hurt, and the way that we're trying, that we want to move towards, I think you said mutual support and flourishing. And I think as a settler person myself, who's really interested in environmental questions, and I've been running you know, a, the oldest environmental organization, I think, in BC for the last several years. And um, it's difficult because as a settler person, we're so conscious of all the harm that we've committed in our time on these lands, and trying to find a pathway forward from really a place of a lot of shame and sorrow and sadness. It's seen where some of those harms have led us. Um, is a question that I really spend my days kind of thinking about. And um, so the question that my paper takes up is around, um, what is the relationship of settler people to treaties that pre-existed the arrival of settlers in many cases, between the Anishinaabe and between other Indigenous nations, with more than human beings that they were sharing the lands with prior to settlers coming. And so the story that I start my paper with is an anecdote about when Lindsay and Heidi and I were doing a session with some law students, I think from the University of Toronto, Lindsay's community at Neshiniming, and Heidi was teaching about the Treaty of the Deer that the Anishinaabe people have with the deer. And one of the students, who was also a settler student, asked the question, well, am I bound by that treaty as somebody who lives on Anishinaabe territory? And now I know that there was this pre-existing treaty that the Anishinaabe have with the deer. Does it apply to me? And Heidi gave a really thoughtful answer to that, but it set me thinking for a long time about my relationship to that. And I think that, so that I'm not gonna, there's not space here, but my paper kind of goes into some of the Canadian case law around that, and some of the Anishinaabe law that I learned during the time that I was um, so fortunate to be able to spend time in Lindsay's community. My understanding from what I was taught during those times. So go into a lot of specifics about both Canadian law and Anishinaabe laws. I understand it on that topic in the paper. Um, but I think that for myself, part of the understanding that I took away from that time was thinking about um, how how sorry, just, how those stories guide us and take root in us. So one of the teachers that Lindsay and I had when we were on her reserve was from Basil Johnson, who's passed away now. And he talked a lot at that time about how at a time in our lives when we may have done the most harm, which I think for a lot of settlers is how we feel right now when we're examining environmental questions, he said that at the time that you've done the most harm, that's when you most need to be reminded of your essential capacity for goodness. And I've thought about that a lot because I think for anyone who's familiar with the stories that environmental organizations tell, a lot of them are about harm, and they're very hard to um, it's very hard to catalyze um, and nourish people in the long term around those stories of harm because they weigh us down over time. They can be create a sense of urgency in the short term, but in the long term, they create a lot of heaviness and shame. So that's one of the things that I took um, from the time that I spent at Nea in terms of that's changed how I engage at Sierra Club BC. So we still tell a lot of those stories of harm, but we've also been looking at stories that can help to heal and that reflect the goodness in people. And so one of the main sources that we look to in that is some of the treaties. So what are the treaties on the territories that we live? So could be the pre-existing treaties, like the one that Heidi shared around the Treaty of the Deer, but also the treaties that settlers entered into. And when I've also been at those law camps, one of the things that also really struck me when I've listened to John Burroughs is that he'll often look for the stories where you do see goodness on both sides, not just at the points, which there are many of, where the promises were broken, but how do we build on the places where people did show up in a good way, both settler and Indigenous, and then how do we build forward from those places? So I think I also am just about out of time, and it's such a complex question to engage with. But I just, yeah, again, really want to thank the editors for giving us the space to think through these questions, because to my mind, these are the most um, profound questions that we face as humans, and I think, and they're of a special importance at this particular juncture in time where um, we are, I think, seeing a lot of need for change, and we're really trying to understand what are our relationship to the laws that govern this land, both Indigenous and Canadian at the most fundamental level. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And extra thanks for being, I assume, the only person who's going to bring a more than human friend into the webinar. That was really nice and extra appropriate. So we'll move on now to Stephen Woods. Stephen Wood is a professor at the Allard School of Law, UBC, and director of the Centre for Law and the Environment there. His research relates to sustainability, globalization, and climate change, among many other things. So Stephen, I will hand over the virtual mic to you.
Thanks very much. My more than human companion is sleeping just behind me, so I won't share, but she's there, and I just heard her wake up when she heard my voice. I'm going to share a screen. So it's been more than 50 years since people started campaigning for inclusion of environmental rights in Canada's Constitution, and you can see a couple of the more famous campaigners on this slide. But the prospects for such an amendment are as dim as ever, and Darcy alluded to that. The article that I wrote uses the metaphor of a constitutional cul-de-sac to take stock of the prospects for legal recognition of environmental rights in Canada in the absence of a formal constitutional amendment. Now, I take a broad view of environmental rights to include human, individual, and collective rights to the environment, and also the rights of the environment itself. It's a good time for this stock taking because the pace of legal developments in this field has increased dramatically in recent years, and it has continued to unfold since the article was finalized last spring. Oh, now I got to figure out how to make the slides go forward. Hang on just a sec. There we are. So in the article, I borrow the metaphor of a cul-de-sac and a reference to a hot day in Iqaluit, which is in the title of the article, from a 2005 book review essay by constitutional scholar Richard Kay. where he said the quote there you see on the screen. And ironically, the conditions for this prophecy came true just 2.5 years later when Iqaluit had its hottest day ever recorded. And the heating is not just in the summertime, but more troublingly in the winter, where winter temperatures are warming even more dramatically than summer temperatures, with severe consequences for people, wildlife, and ecosystems. I borrowed the metaphor of a hot day in Iqaluit not to suggest that the heating of Canada's Arctic has suddenly made the prospects for a constitutional amendment more likely, nor to go into analyzing the legal implications of Arctic climate change, but more to emphasize the cruel irony of Kay's tongue-in-cheek quip and to highlight the urgency of the socio-ecological crises facing Canadian society, which are nowhere more severe than in the Arctic. And what about this cul-de-sac metaphor? Well, constitutional scholars like Kay use the metaphor of a cul-de-sac quite casually, without explication or development, as if its meaning and implications were self-evident. In this article, I try to make the metaphor do a little bit more work, although still in a somewhat playful way. So projecting debates about cul-de-sacs in the urban environment onto the legal environment to generate diagnostic insights about life in a metaphorical cul-de-sac. And everybody here is probably quite familiar with the cul-de-sac as an urban design feature, especially in suburban areas. It's a street with a single outlet, and the closed end has a bulb-shaped turnaround with houses arrayed around the bulb in a kind of a petals on a flower. It creates a tree-shaped street pattern with short streets branching off a trunk, funneling traffic onto the busier arterial roads, in contrast to a grid pattern that has a lot of through streets. Real estate agents and some urban design scholars tout the benefits of cul-de-sacs in terms of safety, privacy, a sense of community, lower incidence of property crime, higher property values, and encouragement of social interaction amongst residents, a quiet, often greener refuge from the concrete jungle. But there's another side to it. Critics argue that cul-de-sac encourage social disconnection and exclusion, discourage walking, cycling, and public transit, and lead to more driving, more vehicle emissions, and more traffic on major roads. One urban design scholar complained, quote, "Cul-de-sacs turn what should be a 100-yard walk into a 2-mile drive," end quote, and they lull parents into a false sense of security when the greatest vehicular danger to their young children is actually, quote, being backed over by a motor vehicle, usually driven by their own parents in their own driveway, end quote. By contrast, the more compact and connected street networks are correlated with lower incidence of obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and traffic fatalities. And although the cul-de-sacs typically have lower burglary rates, they're also harder to access for first responders. So in the article, I looked at 4 of the most active avenues for realizing environmental rights in this constitutional cul-de-sac, and you'll see them here. First is novel interpretation of existing charter rights, especially sections 7 and 15. So far, these efforts have either been, and here I get rather metaphorical, they've either been run over by established legal doctrines before leaving the driveway of constitutional adjudication, or squeezed onto busy arterial roads of existing constitutional rights that are ill-suited and unfriendly to green alternatives, kind of like pedaling a recline bike down a 6-lane highway. That said, youth and Indigenous-led rights-based climate change litigation against federal and provincial governments have the potential to break through. The LaRose case is headed to trial, the Mather case to a rehearing based on appellate rulings that brighten the prospect of vindicating both negative and positive rights to a stable climate, and that reduce to mere traffic calming humps the burden of establishing climate change science, justiciability, and causal connections. The Mizdi case just got the green light to file a further amended statement of claim, so it's still alive too. The second avenue is recognition of Indigenous peoples' environmental rights via Section 35 and domestic implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So courts have recognized that environmental degradation can violate Section 35 hunting and fishing rights, but they have been slow to recognize an Indigenous right to environmental self-governance or to the environmental conditions that make the exercise of Aboriginal rights possible. But there are hopeful developments. Denizens of Canada's constitutional cul-de-sac, I argue, have begun to show more willingness to share the space with the neighborhood's first inhabitants. Settler colonial legislatures and courts have begun to take UNDRIP seriously, enacting UNDRIP implementation legislation, negotiating agreements providing for Indigenous consent to major extractive projects, and relying on UNDRIP to invalidate free entry mineral tenure systems. The Supreme Court has even made a number of mysterious oracular pronouncements that UNDRIP is part of Canadian law. A few lower courts, Montour and Yahé in particular, have gone so far as to hold that Section 35 now protects inherent, generic Indigenous rights, including self-government. It requires Indigenous rights to be defined in accordance with Indigenous laws, and it presupposes an Indigenous right to a healthy environment. Appellate decisions in a couple of those cases are coming any day. So there is some movement toward making Canada's constitutional cul-de-sac a somewhat more salubrious neighborhood for its first and rightful inhabitants, but achieving genuinely neighborly interaction will require settler colonial inhabitants to recognize their Indigenous neighbors as self-governing communities whose laws and rights are entitled to the same respect as their own. In terms of the third avenue, a recent federal statute known as Bill S5 was enacted that recognizes Canadians' right to a healthy environment, which is a significant breakthrough after decades of effort, but very modest compared to what environmental rights champions have actually sought. You could say it's really just a plan to make a plan to implement a right to a healthy environment in the administration of a single federal regulatory statute. You might say it tints the foliage in Canada's constitutional cul-de-sac a brighter shade of green. And the final one brings us more squarely into the realm of our more than human constitutions, and that is movements for recognition of the environment as a legal subject with its own rights, which had its first explicit breakthrough in Canada in 2021 with the Magpie River resolutions. It has gained momentum since then nationwide with private members' bills for personhood of the St. Lawrence River, regional AFN resolutions supporting rights of nature in both Western and Eastern Canada, and a lawsuit by Saskatchewan chiefs claiming that Lake Winnipeg has charter rights. Some of these legal developments seem at least potentially consistent with respecting Indigenous jurisdiction law and cosmology, but it's not clear whether and how these initiatives build upon existing Indigenous legal resurgent movements that recognize various natural entities as ancestors and relatives, or can support Indigenous self-determination. And I'll just finish with a couple final thoughts. So I conclude that our constitutional cul-de-sac pushes environmental rights advocates onto longer, more roundabout routes to destinations that have proved so far largely elusive, and onto crowded arterial roads of existing constitutional rights and general environmental statutes, where greener alternatives are often unwelcome and metaphorical fatalities more frequent. But that said, these efforts and experiments represent a chance to enable the residents of Canada's constitutional cul-de-sac to achieve some of the advantages touted by the champions of real-world cul-de-sac, including a sense of community with all beings, human and otherwise, neighborly interaction between settler, colonial, and Indigenous legal orders, and a stabler and safer environment for children and future generations. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Stephen. That was great. So we're going to hear from our final panelist now, Pamela Spalding. I learned something from all of the papers that I edited for this issue. I think the paper that I learned the most from was Pamela's. The reason is that Pamela is an ethnobotanist, and I am very much not an ethnobotanist. So I was starting from zero and learned a ton from it. So Pamela is a assistant professor at the University of Victoria in the Indigenous Studies department. Her areas of expertise are ethnobotany, resource stewardship, Indigenous feminism, Indigenous legal orders, and customary legal landscapes. Pamela, the floor is now yours.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you for your kind words, Richard, and your help as we went through this process. I just want to thank Jess and Lindsay and everybody else for it's been just a delight to be in this wonderful conversation with all of these amazing scholars. And particularly, as Richard pointed out, I mean, he didn't point out, but I will point out that I am not a lawyer. I am without legal training, although I'm as somebody who studied a lot of anthropology and environmental studies and just being a citizen, I'm interested in how non-lawyers interface with the law, and particularly Indigenous people in general. So I wrote this piece because I'm curious from my work within provincial governments and the territorial government of the Northwest Territories, etc. I'm curious why Indigenous long-term relationships with plants receive so little attention in Canadian law and governance. Indigenous relationships with plants are frequently overlooked in legislation, case law, environmental assessments, and modern treaty negotiations. And I find that Indigenous plant use is generally or popularly referred to by settler culture as gathering, which is a somewhat incidental activity, usually relegated to a distant past and not particularly significant to present-day law or governance. So in embarking on this research, I chose, and actually I was chosen to use one great example to explain how the use and management of native plants is a foundation of Indigenous cultural and legal practice. And it just was this wonderful happenstance of starting to work with Sauk Nation in southwestern Vancouver Island about 10 years ago. They were looking to do something similar to what I was looking to do. So we began this collaboration. And this paper references ethnobotanical research that I did in collaboration with Sauk and how Sauk's enduring relationships with about 100 culturally important native plant species provides legal evidence of their land and resource rights in Canada. So in the paper, I examine how Indigenous people's relationships with native plants could be legally recognized. Plants, and as I said, particularly most native species, have very poor legislative protection throughout Canada. Unlike wildlife or fish, which generally have their own legislation at the federal and provincial levels, only some plant species are referred to in wildlife, fisheries, forestry, environmental assessment, land acts, etc., and modern treaties. And then only in relation to usually very specific, mostly commercial uses or as species at risk. In the common law, Aboriginal rights law appears to also be preoccupied with hunting and fishing rights and almost silent when it comes to defining the interplay between Indigenous legal rights and obligations with respect to native plants within Indigenous territories. And so, I'm just going to highlight a few things in the paper. The paper primarily focuses on how Sauk plant use could be the basis of a claim of Aboriginal rights. And I approach this using the constitutional tests and foregrounding Sauk's evidence of cultivation, plant cultivation, models of plant harvesting rates, how historically Sauk extensively managed forest succession, in ecological succession in forests, how I highlight some plant use and cultural keystone species very significantly for Sauk, and I use some linguistic analysis. And by reviewing Sauk's canon, their full canon of plant knowledge, I attempt to establish the continuity of Sauk plant rights. And I also highlight how plant use has been used in the Silcotin case and the Cowichan case in support of Aboriginal title, as evidence in support of Aboriginal title. And I mean, certainly my research and others' research shows there's obvious and long-standing Indigenous management of plant species in various ecosystems on southern Vancouver Island, which supports a very significant, to my mind, claim of legal rights. And this research is broadly applicable to other First Nations in BC and beyond in terms of method and content. Now, I also found and highlight several problems with constitutional law tests in considering evidence of plant use. And obviously, others have done this before me and continue to do this. But I found a lot of the same criticisms to be present in plant use. So the overpowering emphasis on precisely articulating Aboriginal rights, specific, central, and distinctive practices that are obviously linked to a pre-1846 past narrows what is presented about human-plant relationships and ultimately contradicts that large and liberal view of the evidence required to understand the fullness of these relationships, these ancient relationships and enduring relationships. One difficulty that I found that I really want to highlight here is gender bias. There's, definitely a deep systemic bias about the nature of women's domestic and childcare work as being secondary, universal activities that are not related to the land, which is untrue, and their plant practices as a relic or marginal curiosity of Straight Salish culture. These systemic biases are pernicious throughout the archival and ethnographic literature, and then that spills over and is sort of pumped into arguments, I think, within the Aboriginal rights litigation. So these claims can only go forward then with a more innovative approach to framing evidence of Indigenous women's ecosystems, plant morphology, forest ecology, and phenological knowledges, as well as the social rules and physical infrastructure that they have built for centuries. And also translating Indigenous knowledge is an ongoing problem in the courts. The tests for Aboriginal rights and for Aboriginal title steer evidence towards site-specific cultural practices with a handful of plant species that were and continue to be used most intensively, such as Western red cedar. And this approach further valorizes a few cultural keystone species and places, thereby predetermining what is significant enough to be legally considered, while overlooking the hundreds of other plant species of importance to Indigenous communities. And more importantly, it overlooks the governance value of Indigenous knowledges as it relates to plant use and plants. And this is the most important part because it ignores and overlooks these ongoing connections to territory, which have been, obviously undermined for almost 2 centuries in this region. And so just in the way forward, how do we make or cultivate more space for Indigenous laws? First of all, I believe that the magnitude of native plant use in the traditional economies and lifeways of Indigenous peoples across Canada warrants a much larger discussion about how to introduce Indigenous legal orders related to plant use and ecosystem management into Canadian law and government. And while, it's lamentable that native plants, Indigenous use and stewardship, and particularly women's role in all of this have been so overlooked within both state legislation and Aboriginal rights jurisprudence, I believe this presents this space, this silence, presents a unique opportunity to lead forward with legal imagination and policy innovation and great opportunities for negotiation and finally I really see I just want to end on saying how in the South community women are everywhere. Women are in the band council, they're running the administration, they're land managers, marine managers, they're setting up in Indigenous protected conservation areas, they're leading cultural groups. And so the women are there and doing what they have always done. And I believe that this space needs to be broadened for them to fill that legal and governance space around native plants. So thank you. Sorry for running a little over.
Oh, I think you were right on time. I think we were already a little bit over, but you know what? For all of the speaking slots we had today, we've done pretty well. I think virtual round of applause for everyone. I was trying to think of how I wanted to close this out. Um, and I was thinking initially, this is a nice way for the project to close or end. And then I thought that's not quite right. This isn't really the ending of the project. And I thought, well, maybe it's an apex point, but I don't think it's that either. I think, or if it's an apex point, it's one that I hope keeps going horizontally. I don't think it's even that. I think it just keeps going because now we have this body of scholarship that uh, all of you have bequeathed to the world, and it's so rich, and there's so much for scholars in Canada and beyond to learn from it. So I want to thank everybody for being involved in this project. I want to thank everybody for making it such a good experience for me and for our editorial team at the RCS. Uh, I want to thank everyone for speaking today. Just going in the order that I see you appear at the top of my screen, Stephen, Jess, Hannah, Darcy, Lindsay, and Pamela. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge and your work with us. Thank you also to everyone that contributed to the issue but wasn't able to be here today. So thank you to John, to Jennifer, to Bio, to Rebecca, and to Manisha. I think if it's possible, maybe we can repost right before we close the link to the special issue in the chat, just so that everyone has full access to the issue now for free as of today. I know that it's my job to close out this session, but Jess and Lindsay, this from the get-go, this was your project. If either of you would like to say a few words in closing, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, Richard, no one has really thanked you yet for your amazing role in helping pull this together. We absolutely could not have done this without you, and so much gratitude for patience when we needed it, a nudge along when we needed it, and just the confidence that you've had in the vision for this project since the outset. So thank you for being a partner in this. And Lindsay, thank you. It has just been such a pleasure working on this with you, and to all the amazing people who contributed with such care and thought to this piece of work that just brings me so much heart. I just really appreciate everything that was put into this. So thank you. Lindsay, do you want to
I share these
unmute?
sentiments, yeah, fully. And I guess it's time to go read everyone's work now. So thank you.
Great idea.
So I guess this concludes the sleepover. Thank you everyone for joining us. This has been really nice. And we hope to see you all next time for another CCS webinar. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Hi, thank you.